Welcome to another live video, everyone. What I'm talking about today is throwing your back out. And not only throwing your back out, but throwing your back out by doing something very minimal. And I always say like bending over to tie your shoes or like carrying a clothes basket. And this happens all the time. That's usually when people do throw their back out. It's not when they're lifting something, really, really big. It's when there's just something very small. And they're always kind of confused. They're like, I've tied my shoes thousands of times. Why was it now that I threw out my back? And that's because your brain actually communicates with tiny little muscles in your low back. So there's tiny little muscles between each vertebra that your brain will send messages to, and these just help stabilize the back so that it can be stable and that you can do things like bending over and tie your shoes and things like that. So what happens is sometimes there is a misfire. So these little muscles will either contract or relax, and the brain will tell them to do what. So maybe when you're bending over, they'll both contract, and then when you lean back up, they'll both relax. Or if you're turning one way, one will contract and one will relax, and your brain's telling all your spinal muscles to do this in milliseconds, so it's very quick. And what happens is if there's ever a misfire or like a communication error where one muscle, contracts a millisecond later too early, that's when it can create rotation and you can get that injury or that feeling of you threw your back out. So it's actually a misfire from the brain to that little tiny muscle in your low back where, maybe it should have fired a millisecond earlier, but it didn't, and then it created rotation, and then you throw your back out and you feel that excruciating pain. So it's not the act of bending over to pick up your shoes or whatever, it's actually a misfire from the brain to the low back. So the kind of question is, okay, why did it misfire that time? And that's usually because, so just like your brain will tell, messages to your back will ask, your spine will send messages up to your brain. And most of those messages come clear up here by this very top bone. So if everything's moving properly, then it sends really good information to it. Your brain has a really clear, concise picture of what it needs to do, and then those messages come out really well. But if your upper cervical spine and that top bone isn't moving very well, or it's stuck, then it's going to be sending very fuzzy messages to the brain to where the brain is kind of almost working through static and it's not quite sure what to do. So then it's basing its signals sending back down off of those fuzzy signals coming up. So that's where you kind of get these misfires to where, maybe it should have sent a millisecond earlier, and then you could get this contraction and then you throw out your back. So actually, whenever I see really chronic low back pain cases or someone that came in and threw out their back, the first place in the spine I check is right here in the upper cervical part, because if that part's never clear and it's always locked up, it's always going to be sending those fuzzy messages to the brain to the where the brain's never going to have a really good picture of what to do for the low back. So that's why I always want to clear this up first. And it kind of confuses some people because, they point to their low back and they're like, it hurts right here, it's going down my leg, it's doing all this stuff. And then the first place I check is right here, because they're never going to fully heal and they're always going to be dealing with chronic back pain if that's not taken care of. So that's why I always want to focus on the upper cervical part. So if you know of anyone that like threw out their back or always has back pain, you may want to see if you can find someone like me or another upper cervical chiropractor that can take a look at that very upper neck, at that very top bone, and make sure that's working properly and moving properly so that it's sending the proper input and mechanoreception into the brain, so then the brain can finally tell the low back what to do properly. So that's what I have for you guys today. If you have any questions, always feel free to direct message me or call the office. Our number is 402-504-4676. Hope that helped.